Today, in the Situation Room, we first cast our eyes to the South China Sea. The waters here, more than just waves, they're a battleground of wills between China and the Philippines. An incident that could have been a minor maritime spat has now escalated into a serious international concern, challenging the very notion of sovereignty and regional peace. Next, we're going to turn our attention to the deepening conflict in Myanmar. A nation's struggle for freedom intensifies as rebel forces gain unprecedented ground against the military junta. This isn't just a local uprising, it's a chapter in a saga of a nation's fight for democracy. Our journey's then taking us to the dissolution of the G5 Sahel alliance. This quiet but significant breakup echoes loudly across West and Central Africa, posing new challenges in the war on terror and organized crime. The fallout here definitely has global repercussions, reshaping alliances and strategies in a turbulent region. And then finally today, we're going to delve into the dire situation in Burkina Faso, a country on the brink, grappling with a neglected crisis that's now spiraling into a dangerous vortex of insurgency and extremism. It's a story that's a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the complexities of it. Stay with us as we shed some light on these topics. First up in our lead story today, we travel to the South China Sea, where tensions between China and the Philippines have been escalating all year and have culminated in an incident that took place this past Sunday, December the 10th. On that date, the sovereign nation of the Philippines announced that one of its ships had been forced to collide with a ship belonging to the Chinese Coast Guard after that Coast Guard ship had harassed, blocked, and executed dangerous maneuvers in the vicinity of the Philippine ship. According to the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea, the Philippine ship in question was rammed by the Chinese as it traveled as part of a two-ship convoy delivering supplies. Then he used a water cannon against the engines of one of those two ships, damaging an engine severely in the process. China denies responsibility for the incident and has accused the Philippine vessel of, quote, disregarding our multiple stern warnings and intentionally colliding with the Chinese ship. Now, on its face, this incident might look like a simple misunderstanding. Ships can, of course, travel close to each other and accidents do happen. It might look like a small spat between a couple of countries all too eager to play the blame game with each other over minor offenses. Or it might look like a simple display of bravado by the Chinese Coast Guard, no more threatening than your uncle ripping off his shirt and trying to fight a telephone pole after he's had a few too many. But in reality, this week's collision is a very important development in an important global hotspot where incidents like this have become all too common as China starts to flex its muscles and its neighbor countries start to push back. This collision took place in the immediate vicinity of the Second Thomas Shoal on the Spratly Islands, an island chain that several nations lay claim to and where mainland China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Vietnam all station military detachments. All those nations claim dominion over all or part of the South China Sea, and nearby Brunei has its own maritime territorial claims as well. These aren't claims that any nation is able to back up with a huge base or even a small one. Just for example, the Philippines guards one particular section of the archipelago by stationing troops aboard the BRP Sierra Madre, a rusting ship that was run aground on a reef in 1999 and just left there with some Marines on board. But with mainland China building artificial islands across the archipelago and setting up outposts on what limited land is available, the question of who owns what in the Spratlys has been an object of increasing concern. The trouble is, China, Vietnam, and Taiwan all claim the entire thing, and the Philippines claim a major portion of it. With China looking to assert dominance in Southeast Asia, and especially in the South China Sea, that means that the Spratly Islands are an immediate and highly potent flashpoint where every other competing claim must be defended. The Spratly Islands are strategically important for China, but by and large, the dispute over the archipelago isn't strategic in that sense. It's symbolic, a first line of defense where nations across the region can show China they won't be messed with if they're able to ward off China at all. The December the 10th collision is nowhere near the only incident in this area over the last few weeks. On December the 9th, the Philippines claimed that China had used water cannons to obstruct the movement of 3 other Philippine vessels. A few days before that, the Philippines accused China of swarming a reef off the Philippine coast using some 135 or more military boats affiliated to China's maritime militia. Other collisions occurred in October of this year, prompting international condemnation of China's actions by many Western nations. Even on December the 10th, the Philippine convoy that was rammed had been expected to include civilian fishing vessels joined by youth leaders and other civil groups who had intended to deliver donations to Philippine troops for Christmas. But the civilian portion of the convoy opted out at the last moment because of the Chinese ships in the region. A second convoy also abandoned its mission, citing the constant presence of Chinese ships in the area, making it unsafe to attempt travel. In fact, incidents in this part of the South China Sea have been ongoing for the entire year, ranging from minor, forgettable tiffs to genuinely concerning displays of hostility. In February, China was accused of flashing a military-grade laser at that BRP Sierra Madre outpost that we mentioned earlier, temporarily blinding the Marine station there. In March, China began conducting those same swarms of vessels we mentioned a moment ago, with the first ones featuring swarms that numbered in the 40s or 50s of vessels, ramping up to the 135 or more that were seen in December. In August, China deployed a water cannon against a Philippine ship for the first time, while that ship was also resupplying the Marines on the BRP Sierra Madre. In September, the Philippines tried to strike back by cutting through a floating barrier that China placed on the nearby Scarborough Shoal. Now we're here, after a bigger and bolder geopolitical offense with even more serious ramifications. All this is going down in a part of the world that many nations consider to be vital. Trade through the South China Sea comes with a value of over $3 trillion annually, higher than the GDPs of France, Russia, Canada, or Brazil. The area is considered a flashpoint in Sino-American relations, where the US has significant interests in hemming in Chinese expansion and has carried out joint naval drills with Australia and the Philippines in an attempt to make their opposition clear. Sunday's incident, despite only involving a few ships in a collision that is not believed to have claimed any lives, still drew condemnation from the UK as well as the US. In the past, attempts to mediate tensions within the Spratly Islands have come from the variety of players, not all of them at odds with China, but they've been unable to make any headway.
Making sure that we maintain the rights that we have as a military aircraft to fly in international airspace.
And it's not as if international courts haven't got involved. In 2016, The Hague ruled that China had no legal claim to the South China Sea and was, of course, promptly ignored by China. When discussing what all this means and what may come next, the first question to consider is one of escalation. In a year when China has gone from using blinding lasers to swarming to using water cannons and now we must presume intentionally ramming into another nation's ship, we've got to consider, and fairly urgently, where China might go from here. As journalist Timothy McLaughlin wrote for The Atlantic, the escalation in the South China Sea is the most dangerous conflict that no one is talking about. China's belligerence is the primary driver of that escalation. Ironically enough, The Atlantic published that piece just 8 days before the December 10th collision. Now, though, it's becoming increasingly clear that in a conflict where escalation is the name of the game, China may not have much room left to one-up themselves, unless, of course, they are going to use lethal force. According to author and policy expert Prashanth Parameswaran, writing for the independent think tank Geopolitical Intelligence Services, or GIS, before the December 10th collision, there are 3 basic scenarios for where China and the Philippines will go from here. In the first scenario, China will basically keep up the status quo they established, occasionally antagonizing the Philippines, but not actually partaking in the sort of military actions that might lead to a larger conflict. In the second scenario, China may keep on escalating as they'd been doing, forcing the Philippines to keep escalating as well, forcing China to keep escalating, and so on and so forth. Or, in the third scenario, the conflict between China and the Philippines might have actually started cooling off. But, with the benefit of new information, specifically the incidents of December the 9th and 10th that took place after the analysis was released, it seems all the more obvious that a pattern is emerging. And that pattern leads toward more confrontations, not less, and more violent confrontations, not more distant ones. If those sorts of confrontations do take place, China possesses a major advantage in the South China Sea relative to the Philippines. Just the Chinese Coast Guard alone is almost as formidable as the entire Philippine Navy, and once China's Navy proper enters the mix, it's not even a close contest. At its disposal, China has nuclear attack submarines, nuclear-equipped ballistic missile submarines, multiple aircraft carriers, dozens of destroyers, dozens of frigates and corvettes, and a maritime militia with its own paramilitary vessels operating in large numbers and carrying crews of uncertain training and capability. Across the water, the Philippines have a fraction of the firepower. A direct naval battle between the two nations isn't likely to go down anytime soon, especially because this would draw in the much greater naval power of the United States, one of the Philippines' oldest and staunchest allies. But it's hard to say how long this pattern can go on before people start dying, perhaps in skirmishes between Chinese maritime militia ships disguised as shipping vessels and Philippine Coast Guard ships that have been disguised in the same way. And there's one group of people who are clearly in the crosshairs. The dozen or so Philippine Marines aboard the grounded BRP Sierra Madre, whose continued presence in the area has reached high symbolic significance both for the Philippines trying to keep them there and the Chinese trying to starve them out. As this crisis moves ahead, it must be viewed in context of the rising animosity shared between China and the US, for whom the Philippines are something of a proxy partner in this matter. In the last few months, hopes that Sino-American relations might be on the path toward recovery have largely been dashed between a disappointing summit between President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping and continued rhetoric from both sides on military and economic matters. At the core of the dispute in the South China Sea is one key question. Does China, with its military might, its economic power, and its perceived mandate in Asia, have the right to extend territorial claims across the entire South China Sea? Can it extend those claims despite international rules governing international waters and despite pressure from neighbors who don't have the military might to make China listen, but rely on international norms that require that they be taken seriously anyway? And can China create the sort of might makes right environment that would allow the military dominion over the South China Sea itself, thus granting hegemony over the other nations along its shores? China says yes. The Philippines, the US, and the international order say no. And China appears increasingly eager to test that balance of power in hopes of turning the whole thing on its head. So next up, let's turn our attention to the collapse of the G5 Sahel alliance. Now, as breakups go, it was an unspectacular affair. Less the Beatles imploding while recording Abbey Road, and more a quiet divorce in which none of the participants wanted to drag things out beyond their natural endpoint. Back on December the 3rd, the governments of Burkina Faso and Niger released a statement announcing their intention to withdraw from the G5 Sahel alliance. A collection of 5 West and Central African states, the group had formed back in the 2010s with the aim of combating terrorism and organized crime in the region. By this December, though, it was clear things weren't working. One member, Mali, had already left. Others had been rocked by military coups. Meanwhile, violence in the Sahel region had gone on so bad that the New York Times labeled it the world's worst, quote, epicenter of jihadist violence. All of which is why so few were shocked when Burkina Faso and Niger followed Mali out the door. Nor were they really shocked when on December the 5th the remaining members, Mauritania and Chad, agreed to dissolve the group altogether. Yet just because something isn't shocking doesn't mean that it isn't important. And while most analysts saw the G5 bust-up coming a mile off, they watched its approach not with resignation but with concern. Because the Sahel in 2023 is not an ordinary place. It is a place that is battered by insurgency and extremism, a place where nearly 5 million people have been displaced by violence. A place that also just happens to be crisscrossed by some of the most important geopolitical fault lines of our time. And before we get onto that, we should probably back up a moment and explain 2 things. 1, what exactly is the Sahel? And 2, how did it become so troubled? The answer to our first question is relatively straightforward. Stretching across Africa from Mauritania and Senegal in the west to Eritrea in the east, the Sahel is the point where the dry, hot winds and sand of the Sahara start to meet the fertile plains of the savannah. Politically, though, what exactly constitutes a Sahel country is disputed. For example, the UN's definition excludes Eritrea and Sudan, but includes the geographically non-Sahel nation of the Gambia. What's not in dispute is that, however you define it, the Sahel is an extremely tough neighborhood. In a recent article, The Economist called it the most conflict-ridden region in the world, before offering a list that included the current civil war in Sudan, the border tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the banditry in northern Nigeria. Even by these standards, though, the former members of the G5, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger are having a particularly hard time. This is clearest in the region known as Liptako-Gourma, where the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger meet. There, interlocking ethnic conflicts and jihadism killed over 10,000 people in 2022. This year, that grim total was surpassed in just 9 months. It was this regional violence, along with the threat posed by Boko Haram around Lake Chad, that the G5 was forged to tackle. And that nearly brings us back to our second question. How did the Sahel become so troubled in the first place? Well, for that, you can thank one of the great destabilizing events of the 2010s, the collapse of Libya. Prior to the implosion of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, the western part of the Sahel was a sketchy place, but not unduly so. Remnants of the Islamist groups that fought the Algerian government in the civil war of the 90s were hiding out in rural areas where they'd collectively pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda, becoming Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. But while they'd staged some attacks in Mauritania, AQIM were mostly still focused on their old enemies in Algeria. It was only once Libya exploded that they turned their attention south. The think tank European Institute of the Mediterranean explains what happened. Arms groups, mostly comprising Milan Tuareg and Arab fighters, came back to Mali following the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya and launched an armed insurgency in January 2012. Now, as insurgencies go, it was spectacularly successful. Most of the north of Mali fell to the rebels. When the government was overthrown in a coup, Akim seemed to have decided that they wanted to get in on the action. At first, that meant siding with the rebels. In no time at all, though, it meant stabbing the insurgents in the back and turning North Mali into a state under harsh Islamic law. You might remember the news conference from this time. This was the era when militants occupied Timbuktu and destroyed UNESCO-listed mosques, a time when ancient shrines were defaced. However, it's thankfully not an era that lasted for very long. In 2013, French forces launched an intervention codenamed Operation Sahel. Before the year was out, they'd helped Malian forces retake all key towns and seemingly smashed the jihadists. What remained of Akim and its offshoots fled to the neglected villages on the border between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Unfortunately, they found there not the long arm of the Malian state, but what the Middle East Institute calls weak governance institutions, limited state capacity, corruption, widespread poverty, and ethnic tensions. It was the perfect environment for sweeping up new recruits. Recruits that soon posed such a challenge to the region that the G5 alliance was born. First conceived in 2014, the G5 grew out of the Liptako-Gourma task force between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Beginning operations in 2017, its remit was to tackle terrorism and extremism as well as organized crime. Although its 5,000-strong force was on the small side for such a complex task, the G5 wasn't alone. France provided enormous backing in the form of thousands of troops. The US contributed hundreds of soldiers in support roles. Alongside them, the alliance worked with both regional groupings, ECOWAS, as well as the UN's vast peacekeeping force, MINUSMA. Little could anyone in 2017 have guessed it, though, but these allies would wind up becoming the G5's major weak point. When the alliance fails in its objectives, it wouldn't be just their own governments that the citizens of the Sahel blamed. No, it would also be the outside powers. America, yes, but even more so France. And the perception that Paris was using the G5 to meddle in the affairs of its former colonies would soon help collapse the alliance as effectively as a wrecking ball. Now, the problems were twofold. First was the growing extremism and violence in the Sahel, getting worse even as the G5 ramped up its efforts. Mali collapsed into full-blown warfare, while insurgency swept Burkina Faso. By 2022, 43% of all deaths caused by jihadist attacks across the globe were taking place in the Sahel, compared to just 1% in 2007. Second were the tactics used by the G5 armies. Multiple human rights abuses were committed by Malian forces, abuses that the French turned a blind eye to. With the governments of the G5 already deeply unpopular, growing civilian anger paved the way for extreme solutions. Solutions that would be spearheaded by the very army officers perpetrating these abuses. We're talking, of course, about coups. Starting in the summer of 2020, a wave of military takeovers began to wash over the Sahel. Weak democracies were swept away until an unbroken line of juntas ruled from coast to coast. The first G5 country to fall was Mali, followed by Chad in 2021. Burkina Faso managed 2 coups in 2022 alone, while Niger's elected president was removed in summer of 2023. While Chad's coup was a special case, what the new juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger all had in common was using the security situation as justification for their takeovers. And nor was that all. All three also skillfully rode the wave of anti-French feeling sweeping the Sahel. As the director of the West African Center for Counter-Extremism told Deutsche Welle, in all the 3 countries, there's a strong anti-French sentiment, and this has been building on over time. In each case, the new juntas ordered the expulsion of French troops backing the G5. President Macron announced a withdrawal from Mali in early 2022, with a similar pullout occurring in Burkina Faso just a year later. In Niger, the withdrawal is currently ongoing, but should be completed by the year's end. In the case of Mali, exiting French troops were quickly replaced by Wagner Group forces, something Niger seems to be considering. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the arrival of Wagner has coincided with a massive spike in human rights abuses. Shocking, we know. This is why those experts we talked about earlier were so unsurprised at the G5's implosion this month. France was the alliance's backbone, or perhaps puppet master if you take the pro-junta view, and imagining it could survive without French troops was just wishful thinking. And with Chad still on good terms with Paris, there was no way the G5 nations could avoid an internal split. The result of that split has been Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso clubbing together to create a new alternative alliance. First announced back in September, before the G5's dissolution, the Alliance of Sahel States is a collective defense pact between Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou that aims to take the three back to the old days of the Liptako Gourmet Task Force. At least, that's what it does on paper. In reality, though, analysts have been scathing in their assessment. Speaking to Deutsche Welle, security expert Adib Sani was blunt about the new alliance's ability to counter terrorism, saying it would be very difficult for the new confederation to achieve any results, owing to the fact that these countries are already reeling under pressure by terrorist groups. The quote ends. Hence why so many think the whole counter-terrorism thing is just a lot of talk, that what the Alliance of Sahel States is really meant to do is deter neighboring powers from undoing the recent coups, as ECOWAS threatened to attempt this summer in Niger. That lack of counter-terrorism focus leaves a great big hole in regional security, one that extremists are doubtless preparing to exploit. Given how few successes the G5 had, you might be wondering if its collapse really makes that much of a difference, if this isn't all just a lot of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And sadly, for all its faults, experts think the G5 at least helped contain the Sahel's growing violence. With it gone, things may quickly get much worse. In a gloomy forecast, The Economist predicted a miserable 2024 for the region. The report highlighted the chaos and ethnic massacres already gripping Burkina Faso and the recent intensification of the Tuareg insurgency in Mali, before predicting that jihadist attacks in Niger would likewise increase. An increase that will likely be spurred on by Niger ending G5 cooperation with Chad against their mutual enemy Boko Haram. If this comes to pass, it's not just the civilians of the Sahel that will suffer. Already, the conflict in Burkina Faso is spreading across borders as jihadists begin operations in neighboring Togo and Benin. Meanwhile, North Africa and Southern Europe are likely to see a sharp uptick in refugees fleeing the region, something which could further inflame politics in countries as diverse as Tunisia and Italy. Finally, there are the global ambitions of all these jihadist organizations. Ambitions that may see them try to target American interests as they grow in power. In short, the quiet collapse of the G5 Sahel alliance may turn out to be one of the great underreported stories of 2023, a geopolitical shift that could become a major destabilizing force next year. And as always, we'll try and keep you in the loop as new things develop. For now, though, we're going to bark our regular reporting style a little and zoom into one of the three nations that pulled out of the G5 to really demonstrate just how desperate things have become in the Sahel this year. A nation that is suffering one of the worst security crises on earth, Burkina Faso. Now, even amongst the battered nations of the Sahel, Burkina Faso's insurgency is on another level. The Norwegian Refugee Council has called it the world's most neglected crisis. In a 2023 article, War on the Rocks declared that the country is dying. Superficially, the problem is the same as that affecting Mali and Niger. A vast jihadist network has managed to fuse local problems with the ideology of international terrorism to create a deadly cocktail of anger and fanaticism, one that's found all too many willing takers in areas long neglected by the government. Indeed, many of the groups that are benefiting are the same ones battling for control in other Sahel states, groups linked to al-Qaeda like Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam or Jinim and its local branch Katabat Hanifa, or regional offshoots of ISIS. Despite these similarities, though, Burkina Faso's situation differs from Mali and Niger in one rather key way. Here, the jihadist movements have gained so much ground that the nation has all but collapsed, while the governments in Niamey and Bamako are still just about in control of their nations. The government in Ouagadougou barely holds 40% of Burkina Faso's territory. According to Africa Defense Forum, quote, terrorist groups such as Katabat Hanifa now control nearly 7,000 square kilometers of territory in an arc following Burkina Faso's northern borders with Mali and Niger, then southeast to the borders with Benin and Togo. Within this arc, insurgents are laying siege to 36 towns, completely sealing nearly 1 million Burkinabés off from the outside world. Unsurprisingly, these multiple blockades have led to acute food shortages. Inside the besieged towns, healthcare services are collapsing, utilities like water pipes are subject to attack, and people are scraping by on the few scraps of food that they can still access. Back in August, the Africa Centre estimated around 650,000 people were suffering extreme hunger, a condition that in some regions was starting to tip over into outright famine. Rather than stay put, many have tried to flee the affected places. Right now, almost 10% of Burkina Faso's 22 million population are thought to be displaced, internal refugees escaping a hurricane of violence. Speaking of violence, the death toll has been wild. This November, New Humanitarian estimated that over 6,000 people have been killed in Burkina Faso in 2023. Other sources put the number closer to 9,000. That would place the conflict in Burkina Faso among the worst in the world, eclipsing the gang violence in Haiti, the drug war in Mexico, and the ongoing civil wars in Syria and Yemen. But it wasn't always like this. Even as Mali was buckling beneath insurgency last decade, Burkina Faso remained relatively safe. As late as 2018, Al Jazeera reports a mere 303 Burkinabés killed that year by jihadist activity. Since then, though, all hell has broken loose. The first spike came in 2019, when annual armed conflict deaths shot up to over 2,000 and remained there for the next 3 years. The second spike came in 2022, when the death toll soared to over 4,000. Now we appear to be witnessing the third spike, one likely driven by the factors discussed in our previous chapter. Back in 2014, the year the G5 was first conceived, Burkina Faso was riding a wave of hope. Dictator Blaise Compaoré had been overthrown, and the nation was transitioning towards democracy. When the spillover from Mali's conflict arrived in 2016, it was even seen as containable. Burkina Faso's first homegrown jihadist group was more concerned with inequality and the state's neglect of people in its north than setting up a brutal caliphate. Sadly, things wouldn't remain that way. As in Mali, more internationally focused groups began to emerge, recruiting from disenfranchised rural areas. The Africa Center lists examples like the Islamic State of the Greater Sahara and the Jenim-affiliated Messina Liberation Front. But it would be the coups that really turbocharged Burkina Faso's collapse. The two Mali coups of 2020 and 2021 so destabilized the neighborhood that jihadist forces were able to expand their reach and power, allowing them to increase operations in Burkina Faso. But this had nothing on the effects of the two Burkinabe coups of 2022. In both January and September that year, army officers overthrew the government, arguing that those in charge had failed to smash the jihadists and keep ordinary people safe. While both the original civilian government and the junta formed after the January coup pursued policies of dialogue with armed groups, the second coup brought to power 35-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who favored a solution known as total war. Now we'll get on to exactly what total war means in a second. First, though, we need to note that neither process actually works. According to the Africa Center, quote, the number of people killed by militant Islamist violence has nearly tripled compared to the 18 months before the January 2022 coup. The insurgents have also creeped toward the capital. While the plateau Ouagadougou sits on has mostly been spared the carnage afflicting other areas, jihadist groups have been slowly cutting off key transit routes, bringing supplies from Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and Togo. As the African Defense Forum summed it up in an October headline, extremists threaten to encircle Burkina Faso's capital. Not that you'd know it from visiting the city. Inside the capital itself, the total war plan is hailed as a victory. Captain Traoré is praised as the man who stood up to the jihadists and the French and saved the country. According to The Economist, this perception is mostly thanks to government propaganda, including TV shows that broadcast endless footage of Turkish-bought drones blowing up rebels. It's also because the government has clamped down on critical reporting and begun arresting and sending those who oppose total war to fight on the front lines. So now might be the perfect time to explain what exactly Captain Traoré's total war plan is. To put it simply, total war is what it sounds like, an attempt to coax or push as many Burkinabés into fighting the jihadists as physically possible. But while this has included mass conscription, it's also got a unique and, according to critics, badly destabilizing component: the Volontaires pour la Défense de la Patrie, or VDP. Basically legal armed militias, the VDPs were first suggested back in 2020, but only really became a feature of the conflict in late 2022 when Captain Traoré began a recruitment drive. Since then, anywhere between 50,000 and 70,000 civilians have joined up and been given weapons to fight the jihadists. As an idea, the VDPs do make sense. War on the Rocks points out that Burkina Faso's armed forces, including the police, only number 12,000, far too few to fight a sprawling insurgency. In practice, though, the VDPs seem to be making the situation worse. Rather than fighting terrorists, many volunteers seem to be more concerned with carrying out brutal ethnic massacres of the Fulani minority. Many in Burkina Faso associate the Fulani with jihadism. Even prior to Captain Traoré's ascendancy, audio messages were reported circulating on WhatsApp calling for violence against the minority group and using language reminiscent of the Rwanda genocide. Captain Traoré, though, has taken things to another level. His government encourages the racial profiling of Fulanis and has taken little concrete action against VDP militias that have carried out ethnic massacres, including a massacre in Nona that left 80 civilians dead. The result has been similar to what you'd get if you took any highly combustible situation, brazenly chucked rocket fuel on it. With atrocities increasing against Fulanis, more and more are starting to do what the government accuses them of doing and joining the jihadists who now paint themselves as the group's protectors. Per War on the Rocks, quote, "It has been well documented that the security services abuses have fueled radicalization." End quote. With each new twist of this blood-soaked screw, the chances of peace returning to Burkina Faso get smaller and smaller. Even with the VDPs on side, no serious analysts think Captain Traore's government is capable of winning this war. Ouagadougou has already expelled the French, and the scale of human rights abuses means other Western powers are unwilling to intervene. Although the Wagner Group is rumored to be exploring a partnership, their fighters have yet to turn the tide in Mali's conflict. Meanwhile, the root causes of Burkina Faso's military are only implanting themselves deeper in society, becoming thicker, more knotted, impossible to cut. And as central authority evaporates in Burkina Faso, the dangers of jihadists launching large-scale attacks into countries like Ghana, Benin, or Côte d'Ivoire only grows. This is what it means for peacekeeping efforts to break down in the Sahel. Not just an abstract dissolving of alliances, but a world in which thousands are dying and jihadists are free to run wild and destabilize so many other nations. It's certainly not pretty. And it's understandable that few on the international stage want to place too much focus on this complex problem. But Burkina Faso's chaos may well be what awaits other Sahel nations in the coming year. If that happens, then the world will have no choice but to act and try and stop the nightmare from spreading any further. And in our final story today, we're going to return to the civil war in Myanmar, where a coalition of rebel groups is quickly gaining ground against the nation's ruling military junta. Now, we've spoken about this conflict a month ago, so for an in-depth view of what the situation was at that time, our prior Situation Room episode is there waiting for you. But for viewers who are up to date on this particular conflict, bear with us for just a quick moment of background that should put today's news in context. To put it mildly, Myanmar has been in a state of active conflict for a very long time, with civil war, political upheaval, and even genocide being tragically commonplace there. But the current civil war has been going on since February of 2021, when a civilian-led government under Nobel Peace Prize winner and Myanmar State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi was deposed in a military coup. That coup was led by a guy called Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who's widely regarded as the architect of all that state-led violence that's happened in Myanmar ever since. Most prominently, a massive air campaign that's seen regime warplanes and helicopters actively perpetrate mass casualty attacks against unarmed or minimally armed civilians. There are a lot of people in Myanmar who are interested in taking up arms against the military, and many have done just that. But until recently, that brutal air campaign has allowed the government to hold the entire population hostage. But the situation shifted with the start of Operation 1027, an unprecedented offensive action that was started by Myanmar's so-called Three Brotherhood Alliance, or 3BHA. The 3BHA is primarily made up of three large ethnic minorities: the Arakan Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the Ta'ang National Liberation Army. Within weeks, the 3BHA realized impressive success, bringing down dozens of military camps and beating back both the junta's forces and their allies in civilian pro-military militias. The 3BHA has seized the momentum in the civil war, and the nation's primary opposition movement, the United Unity Government, has openly called for every rebel group in the country to rise up and help the 3BHA in their fight. Many resistance groups have taken up that task, quickly expanding the war's overall front, while the 3BHA's ranks have swelled to the tens of thousands of members who now have some very potent captured military equipment at their disposal. Major cities have now been brought under rebel control, regime soldiers have begun to surrender in greater and greater numbers, and Myanmar's grinding civil war, stuck in a stalemate for so long, now appears to have been unstuck. For upward of 2 months, the 3BHA and Myanmar's many rebel groups have had the initiative. Now, in mid-December, the situation for the 3BHA is looking better than many international observers would have ever thought possible. According to Radio Free Asia, over 20 towns and 300 military outposts have already fallen to the 3BHA and other rebel militias who've collected all the rifles, ammunition, and body armor that they could want, alongside government-issued jeeps and trucks, as well as troop carriers and even heavy artillery pieces. Myanmar's Rakhine State, Chin State, Shan State, and Kayah State are now largely under rebel control, while while Cayenne and Kokand states are being wrestled away from the junta with increasing effect. To put it simply, Myanmar's militias have made it abundantly clear that they can deal with the junta's military force in the countryside, and they now have the means to force the garrisons of any established outpost to either retreat or surrender, or rather quickly. But what that means, in a practical sense, is that Myanmar's civil war is now entering a second stage, where the Three Brotherhood Alliance will now have to challenge the junta's authority in places where the military can dig in. And that's two main sets of targets: major military bases and cities. In both locations, the junta can draw upon much larger numbers of troops, as well as well-stocked armories and heavy fighting vehicles and air power. But the militias have not been deterred from embarking on this next step, and as of now, battles rage over several key targets across the country. The Iraqi army, one of the three main militias in the 3BHA, took advantage of a brief ceasefire with the government in order to consolidate their forces, and have now been able to seize multiple major military bases in Rakhine and Jin states, even despite accusing the junta of having used chemical weapons in defense of those bases. The MNDAA, another of the three core 3BHA militias, has focused on the town of Laokhang, capital of Myanmar's Kakang state, after isolating and defeating a major military force on the city's outskirts. And in the town of Loikor, capital of Kayar state, independent ethnic militias are working hard to assume control, which seems as if it will be forthcoming before too long. More towns are falling in more provinces. Rebel forces are isolating strategic highways and taking border checkpoints, and any independent militias who've been hedging their bets thus far are increasingly finding reason to get over their hesitation and join the fight. In response, the Myanmar junta has proven unable to get any large-scale counter-offensive going in the countryside. The rebels are simply far too well entrenched to make such an operation seem feasible, especially with the time that it would take to move ground forces into a position for a push. Instead, Senior General Min Aung Hlang's Air Force has, as usual, taken a leading role. On December the 3rd, the opposition National Unity Government's Ministry of Human Rights announced that the junta had carried out at least 84 airstrikes and at least 112 artillery strikes, killing hundreds of civilians in the process. Min Aung Hlaing himself has been forced to acknowledge his government's troubles in fighting the rebels, although he's pinned the blame for the junta's losses on supposed foreign interference rather than the several rebel armies using his own rockets, consumer drones, and heavy equipment against him. The regime has begun to circle the wagons around the fortress city of Naypyidaw, the major northern city of Mandalay, and the capital of Yangon. But while those targets will prove very difficult for even the best armed rebels to attack, the junta's choice belies a much more sobering reality. Aside from those few strongholds, there are very few places left that regime forces believe they can hold. Where the rebel offensive goes next, we obviously can't say for sure, but we can make an educated guess that at a bare minimum, the 3BHA and their allies have proven more than able to sweep through most of Myanmar's rural areas if given enough time. The junta simply does not have the troops or the firepower to resist the current offensive in the countryside, meaning that any outposts that are ordered to hold out are highly likely to be overwhelmed once the rebels arrive. More likely, the regime may begin abandoning its outposts and equipment entirely, withdrawing to the points it believes to be defensible. And that, according to Radio Free Asia, is likely to lead to broader action in what has become the civil war's newest front, a campaign of assassination and sabotage that threatens Myanmar's biggest cities directly. That campaign is already well underway. For instance, see the December 1st assassination of a man named Than Tun, who had been a member of Myanmar's pro-democracy factions before changing sides and becoming chairman of a pro-military political party. But any effort to take the fight to the cities will require the rebels to rebuild urban resistance networks that have been dismantled in the last 2 years, and it will require venturing into regime-controlled areas where everyone and everything will be under scrutiny. The junta has been careful to project an air of calm and normalcy in the big cities, which they'll be intent on preserving no matter how much guerrilla action they've got to deal with. But if the rebels can begin launching high-profile attacks in spite of the surveillance, the regime's efforts may backfire, tacitly showing their people that their best efforts are not enough to stop the rebel infiltration. While the Myanmar rebels will need time to push the junta out of the rest of the countryside bases and strongholds, a broader strategic view of the civil war reveals that it may be coming close to an endgame. Support for the junta has never been high, but it's continued to erode all across the country, and to turn of public opinion in the major cities could make the difference between Min Aung Hlaing Wang's survival and his ouster. When the National Unity Government and its affiliated rebel groups can take territory, they've been able to provide the calm and the humanitarian support that's been lacking for so long, and they bring positive relations with neighboring China, India, Thailand, and Bangladesh, to the point that even if none of those nations are outright supporting the war effort, they're likely to see the opposition government as a trustworthy partner when it comes time to govern. With that recognition may come foreign aid, humanitarian support, international political legitimacy, and perhaps even a return to civilian rule, all across Myanmar. When the next phase of the battle in Myanmar begins, we'll return here to share what we've learned, just as we will for the crisis zones in the South China Sea, in Burkina Faso, in the Sahel, and in many other hot zones around the world. Until then, we're signing off.